Alright, Gamer Bears, it is time for another new episode of Unused Content and Games, and today we're picking up with a part 2 where we left off from part 1 of the Mega Man X2 Unused video. So, starting off with Moth, let us begin, but before we truly begin, I'd like to ask those of you, if at any point in time you enjoy this video and you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's for free, and you can always change your mind later on. And hit that bell button for more so you don't miss out on more unused videos like this one. So, let us begin Moth or Metamor Mothminos. Our level graphics. To get this earlier design of his background, as well as a later prototype plus the final version. It's a little hard to see, but check out the rightmost set of clouds. They look fine in the early prototype and later prototype, and the final version, one of the clouds tiles have been incorrectly flipped upside down. It's really hard to tell, but you can kind of see it there. Let's get a closer look at it. You can kind of see that right over here. It's a very minor thing. Makes me wonder why they changed that. Alright, continuing. Some of the backgrounds in the early prototype have industrial waste barrels and what looks to be a toxic ooze. These tiles were removed in the later versions, and the space was taken up by a duplicate of those rectangular pipes. And you can see that right down here. Bad gateway. Weird. Alright, it's just showing me this, so I guess this is the best you can get. You can kind of see the little green toxic bits down here. And this one is also a bad gateway, apparently. Alright then. Alright, the version of the background in the earlier prototype is 448 pixels tall. The later prototype extends this upwards by 128 pixels, but in a pretty sloppy way. Look at the piece of brown wall just floating in the middle there. You can kind of see that right over here. They erroneously flipped two of the fences and pipe pieces that flank the brown walls at the bottom. Just like the previously mentioned clouds, this error persists in the final version. The final version adds another 64 pixels to the length of the background, but does it at the bottom instead of the top. Now let's get a closer look at that. Alright. Extending the background downward fixes a BG cutoff area that can be seen in both prototypes, but it's not clear what the upward extension was supposed to fix, and you can see that right over here. Alright, the large chunk of garbage are more efficiently crushed in a later prototype. Here's what it looked like in the early prototype. Looks much larger than it does here. Alright, now more on the layout. Three of the chunks of ground here look a bit out of place with the adjacent tiles. Especially the ones on the right of the junked B-blader. These were fixed in the later prototypes, but in a lazy way. They were also replaced by the same strip of land. The background junk that stretches between the two green platforms looks connected in the early prototype and not in the final version. And here's a closer look at that. One of the tiles under the second hanging reploid was changed. In the early prototype, that tall brown beam looks like it's floating in the air, not much later in the final version. Not so much in the later versions, I should say. And you can see that right over here. You can see it just floating a little bit there. I guess that just wasn't fully fixed when it was first made. And you can tell they fixed it over here. The secret area near the start of the stage already exists, even in the earliest prototype, right up here where the heart piece is. Which I don't think I got that in my playthrough now that I think about it, but oh well. But nothing's been placed there yet, and isn't accessible. The final version adds an extra life and a heart tank, and the Disc Boy 08 that the player has to freeze to get up there, using Crystal Hunter, this guy right over here. The two more hanging reploids were added at the start of the first gravity section, and you can see that here. The long orange beam was moved over to the left by 16 pixels, very precise. It's not possible to get into the light capsule in the early prototype, likely because it wasn't made yet and spin wheel hadn't been created yet. The object that makes those tiles destructible by spin wheel haven't been coded in yet, like I just said. But we can see that the destructible tiles would have extended a bit further down. So it was a little less easy to see, since you can't really see it in the final version anyways, outside of this little zoom out over here. Only being able to see half of that long orange beam in the area is probably why it was moved in a later version. To be moved over. I guess they just didn't want it to overlap a bit. You can see that here. Also, those hands sticking out of the ground kind of look like they're giving a thumbs up, but they're not. There were two changes to the light capsule room that fixed developer oversights. The first was adding an extra 128 by 128 foreground blocks to the left of the room. And I can't get to this one either, it seems. Yep, alright. So I guess this is the best we can see. And this little platform being added here, which isn't in the prototype version. In the later prototype, it's possible to see where the foreground ends by sliding down the left wall in the chambers, adding an extra block fixed to that. The second was the addition of a thin platform to the entrance of the area. Now let's take a closer look at that little entrance. Alright, and for some reason it looks like X took some damage here somehow. I guess there was an enemy there. The platform was added to fix a glitch where the player coaxes one of the hanging reploids from above to enter this area. If the player gets hit while the Dr. Light hologram is talking, they'll be able to move around freely, which isn't supposed to happen in the middle of a cutscene. Since I guess the game doesn't really know what to do when X gets hit while in the middle of a cutscene like this. They could have just fixed that glitch, but I mean, it's nice that they kind of proved it for any players who might try to do that. This includes entering the light capsule before the hologram is finished talking. There are several graphical glitches that can occur if X performs a Giga Crush here, including a sprite of Dr. Light's portrait from the first game appearing. Apparently it's also present just behind, or just hidden behind the dialog box, and the dialog box is extended to the length of the screen. Pausing and unpausing the game will correct this glitch. And you can see that right over here. And Bad Gateway once again. Alright, I'm seeing double. 8 hanging reploids. And once again with the Bad Gateway. Yep, alright. Well, this is the closest you can see, sadly. I only see 4 of them here, but whatever, in the final version. Alright, both screwdrivers, or screw-rivers, whatever the heck they're called, were replaced by disc boys, which now properly face X. The upper left alcove is where the heart tank sits in the prototype, instead of where it is in the final game. Which I guess they probably didn't want it to be up there since it's a little too out in the open compared to the final game's location of it. There's life remains, but it moved more to the right. They could have put it more to the left, but whatever. Alright, yeah, let's get a closer picture of this. Alright, both strivers, I really don't know how to say that, were replaced by... Oh, wait, I already said that. A single Polaroid V1 was added to this room. Looks like this guy over here. And it's a prime position to latch onto the player's head, giving them a nice introduction to how they can manipulate the player's movements before they start swarming the stage later. It's a teaching element that happens a lot in the platforming Mega Man games. It's called decent game design so you can get the player to know how to deal with certain obstacles and or enemies. Alright, here's what that looks like without it. Alright, here it is with that enemy there. There are 6 spin wheel destructible blocks here that will both in the way to the X entrance room. Those blocks were taken out in the final version, which is now instruction free. These blocks right over here, it looks like. Probably would need a, like they said, spin wheel to break them. Our 5 pipe corner tiles. The ones on the edge of the 2 ledges on the bottom left and one on the topmost ledge are incorrectly flipped in a later prototype. They're correct in the earlier prototype, so it's not really clear what caused them to suddenly flip. They were all fixed in the final version, but they're scrabblers. Their only appearance in this stage, these guys, were replaced by disc boys, which now sit on the once empty ledges. 2 large energy pickups were placed on the bottommost ledges, as you can see there. Our one has hanged Reploids placed before the X-Hunter room, as you can see right here, while the player has to double back after beating the X-Hunter in the final game. In both prototypes, there's one more shutter as well. Now let's show that off right over here. Alright, leading to a short alternate path where there is not much here. Just a long drop down to the end of the large gravity room. But it's something. This room was worked on a bit later, after the later prototype. Check out this life embedded in the wall, where the platform on the right used to be. It's not clear why it was removed, since both versions' chunks end up occupying the same amount of space in the ROM. Alright, here's a prototype version of this room. Can't get a closer look at that, same with this one. So I guess this is how we're going to look at it. Alright, no layout changes were besides the room and the ceiling of the alternate path, but plenty of objects changes in both prototypes. All Garakuta's robots are on the middle path and are either on spikes or spike adjacent. The final game places one on the upper path and moves the other 2, making them more of a threat. Plop after Paraboloid R5 and a large energy pickup in there and the area is complete. And here's what that looks like. Man, that took a while to load. Anyways. Guess it's a different type of PNG, that's most likely why. There are only 4 Paraloids in the sample build, and they are facing left for some reason. The final layout reorients them and adds 4 more. 2 that are grounded, and 2 that drops from the ceiling. I guess they're only like that. Like, if you think about level editors like Mario Maker, some enemies are kind of turned a certain direction, so that could be why it's like this here. And they just weren't facing the right direction before in that build. And here's a closer look at that. The bottoms of the hanging wire tiles are transparent in early prototype, letting the player get brief glimpses of the background. They're opaque in final versions, or in later versions. The layout seen in the samples has spikes on the ceiling wires that don't appear anywhere in the final version. Like the spike in the large gravity room, these deal no lethal damage to X. The Paraloid V1s are positioned much that if the player gets unlucky, they'll latch onto X's head and make him jump into the spikes. The 3 Paraloid R5s take the place of those spikes in the final version. In the final game. And the cannon driver replaces the 3 hanged Reploids at the end. I guess the reason why those are removed is that could cause a lot of really unfair deaths for players, so I guess during testing that happened quite a lot. I mean, those are pretty close to the ground. That's almost Mega Man and base level design right over there. Alright, now for Morthmoth himself. The final version makes Speedburner more effective because that is his weakness in said game, so I wonder why just a little damaged him in the prototype build. doubling the damage from the charged version, or for the charged version, and makes the charged Magnum Mine do more than the base damage, as you can see right over here, since that weapon also sucks in the debris that Moth's cocoon is constantly generating. It's a nice alternative. Our damage taken from the debris, 1 HP in the prototype and 2 HP in the final, and from the dust, 1 HP in the prototype, 2 in the final version. The way that Moth sucks in debris is different. In both prototypes, the garbage comes on a line that slowly rotates clockwise, as you can see over here. 2 pieces of debris are generated on opposite ends of that line and flow in the cocoon. In the final version, the garbage comes in like a spiral on a wheel that rotates clockwise. Up to 5 pieces of junk are on screen at a time, and the tighter formation of debris and faster rotation makes dodging a more active process, as you can see right over here. Alright, all versions have the same boss room layout, but only in the sample version can the player reach the top. As you can see here, there's a ceiling there. The final version cuts it off before they can even see the ceiling. Either that or the final version straight just doesn't have a ceiling, but whatever. Moth is silent in the early prototypes. In later prototypes, the only action that has a sound effect is Moth's laser, which uses Wire Sponge's lightning sound as a placeholder because the sound effect for said laser hadn't been made yet. Alright, but you can see that ceiling right over here. That isn't in the final version. Maybe it's for the better they don't have a ceiling up there. It's because you'd constantly be hitting your head, so I'm kind of glad they took that out. The cutscene of the Paranoid S-38 breaking out of the glass capsule and processing the old robots doesn't exist in the early prototype, just wasn't made yet, that's probably why. Though the capsule is already present at this point, old robots just rise out of the ground instead, as you can see here. Alright, now, Flame Stag stage. There are a lot of smaller changes that were made in this background, going from bottom to top. In the earlier prototype, the bottommost tree layer is barely filled in. The later prototypes and final game fills in every blank space with tree tiles. The tree layers further away from the camera are arranged differently, and the ones furthest away from the camera is lower in the final tile map. And that's what you can see here. Also, most of this background is kind of unfinished. And here you got a lot more foliage over here instead of it just being a flat green color. Alright, the second mountain in the prototype goes up further, but just cuts off. It's easy to see where the mountain ends. The later layout mirrors the top of a mountain instead of that mountain. Both mountains have more edge tiles in later builds. In the early prototype, the clouds are horizontally symmetrical and they are placed closer together. Later versions add more unique cloud tiles to the tile sets, making them a bit smaller but asymmetrical. One of the clouds was moved to the left just above the first mountain. Here's what that looks like. I know it's probably just a cloud, but that kind of looks like another mountain in the background. The background after the rising lava section is made up of 2 layers. The main layer is used for the brighter clouds near the second cave section, and the second layer is used for the darker clouds. The early prototype only has a main layer of clouds. And here's what that looks like, this little piece over here. Here's what it looks like later on, with the clouds looking significantly different. Meaning that the sample single color background is all the player sees for most of that section. And you can see that here. Too bad there's a bad gateway. Can't do that one. Alright, the 2 thick pipes in the early prototype background were moved to the foreground later in the game. And here's what that looks like. Also bad gateway. Great. And I guess this one too, yeah. Alright, layout. The pipes at the bottom use slightly different shading in the early sample. Two of the cliff tiles on the bottom right are the ones that should be used in the interior section, which don't have transparency. They were both fixed in the later prototypes, and here's what that looks like. Let's just get a closer look at this one from right over here, just so we don't have that long loading screen again. The cliff at the very top of the first section has a steep drop-off in the middle in the early prototype. It slopes more gradually in later versions. The later prototype adds an invisible, unclimbable wall on the top left side to keep the player from going over the cliff. Makes sense? Note that the cliff tile decorations, those little rectangle bricks looking dallies, whatever that means, dealies, I guess, are different between an early prototype and a later prototype final game, something that applies to every single cliff. And here's what that looks like. Notice how the little middle part over here where the life is a bit smaller in this build than it is in this build where it's noticeably wider. In both prototypes, there's extra life on the cliff where the sub-tank sits. All versions have another extra life and a couple of screens to the right. So the prototypes are being a bit too generous here. Yeah, a little too generous. You got both a life and a sub-tank? God damn. And here's a closer look at that. And in the final version, there is no life here. Hey, there it is. And in addition to the expected cliff face change, the early prototype also starts the cave section of the stage earlier on, and here's what that looks like. Can't see that one, it seems. Same with this, yeah. Alright, there are 3 more bright large stars. Oh yeah, this section. This section is so annoying. In both prototypes, all of the bright less stars, except for the one at the top right, are the walking type. While in the final game, they're both stationary. A small number of lives and weapon energy pickups were added to the bottom left part of the cave, as you can see right over here. The usual cliff face changes can be seen here, as well as the repositioning of background walls, rocks, and lights. More wall decorations were added after the early prototype. The cliff wall on the bottom left is missing edges tiles in the early build. Standard cliff's face changes, and here's what that looks like. In my playthrough, I always neglected to get this life because, well, that's annoying to get while also trying to run away from the lava. The climb up is straightforward in the early prototype. The later prototype adds a chamber to the middle of the section, but doesn't include anything in it. In the final game, places a small life energy pickup and a large weapon energy pickup there. The wall on the upper right hand has a deeper indent in the samples, making the climb up more difficult without switching to the left side. Alright, standard cliff face changes as well. Notice how this little health pickup is here, but in the other 2 versions it's not. And once again with the bad gateway. And a long loading time. Oh, bad gateway, so this is how we're going to look at it. Alright, again, the chamber doesn't exist in the early prototype and is empty in the later prototype. This little chamber here where the heart tank is. The final game adds a heart tank and a bar weighing that fills in the right wall. The dark brown rocks in the rock wall behind the large life energy pickup uses an incorrect tile in both prototypes. The final game fixes this by extending the floor to the left. Standard cliff faces change, and here's a closer look at all of that. And I guess this was most likely put here before any items or enemies could be placed there for testing purposes while testing out the lava physics. And that was a bad gateway. Alright, the photo to the left of the first lava platform section dips further down in both prototypes. The later prototype adds a grassy tile before the lava starts. As you can see that right over here, it looks out of place. Kinda does, yeah, especially if that lava touches it, it's gonna catch fire. The platforms coming out of the lava uses an unfitting cooler palette in the early prototype. Standard cliff face changes, yes. Like whoever made this article has definitely got a sense of humor. Yeah, this color does look a little bit cooler than in the final versions. Or the later versions, I should say. The ceiling pipe tiles were flipped after the earlier prototype for reasons unknown. The first platform has a pipe on it in the early prototype, but is all natural in later builds. The edge tile for the gap at the bottom were added after the early prototype. The two Barai Lestars greet the player when they reach the X-Hunter's room entrance. The final game is more kind, giving the player a large life energy pickup instead. These cliffs faces changes are standard. Oh boy, game, you're far too kind by giving me this health upgrade. I mean, not health upgrade, but health heal. Our ceiling pipes flipped once more, and 4 lights, not 5, were placed below those pipes. And here's what that looks like. Alright, background, walls, lights, small rocks, repositioned, rearranged and cleaned up, and this picture over here is completely blank, but whatever, in the later prototypes to benefit you, the player. At the top, across this large lava-filled room, is considerably tougher in the sample versions. There are only 4 platforms. They're spaced farther apart, and there aren't any floating platforms to guide the player down from there, or dropping down from above. A large life and weapon energy pickups are added to the bottom left corners. The large life energy pickup and heart tank were replaced with a single life. And the chamber at the bottom of the right wall was filled in. Cliff face changes come standards with all new models. And here's what this looks like. I notice how the heart tank is there in this prototype, but then was replaced with a life in the final version. And note how the background also isn't fully finished either. Makes you wonder how they expected the player to get that there. That's probably why they changed it. I want to say maybe using charged speed burner and an air dash simultaneously, maybe? I don't know. Later versions put in this platform over here, as these platforms actually, as you can see. I went too far back, my bad. Alright, there's nothing there. Alright, the small hill in the upper left in the early prototype was partially leveled in later versions. The 2 small horizontal pipes behind the 2 larger angled pipes aren't on the same level in the early prototype, but are in later versions. Wow, incredible. More cave indent filling innings in the final version, along with moving 2 more guns. Those flaming flying squirtles. Did I say squirtles? I meant to say squirrels. The pipes outside were redrawn. They look a bit flat in the prototype versions. As standard cliff faces changed, and these are bad gateways as well. Yep. Alright, so here's a closer look at them. And notice how some grass tiles up here were changed in later versions, not to have them. The wall above the right boss shutter was fixed in the final version. Cliff faces. And here's a closer look at this room. Alright, this is where those deleted background pipes end up in later versions. Makes for a better visual setup. The set of railing at the bottom was broken up into two sets. Two of the that's piles at the bottom moved more towards the wall, while the one in the middle underwent some sort of pile mitosis, whatever. Standard changes, and here's what it looks like. In the middle of Flamestag's boss room. And you can clearly see the background isn't fully finished. Now they have a bit more background over here. And the bottom platforms or whatever, that hold up said platform, seem to be more numerous now than here. There's 4 of them instead of 3, like in the previous version. Alright, a single cliff tile above the boss shutter was changed. That's not standard at all. Again with that sense of humor, and here's a closer look at that. The final game adds Sonic Slicer as a secondary weakness. It's an effective second option, considering how often he triangle jumps around the place. Makes sense. It could be really good against him, though his main weakness being Bubble Splash. Neither the charged version or the uncharged version do more damage than the other. Alright, damage taken. From contact, you take 3 in the prototype, but in the final game, you only take 2. I kinda wish more Mega Man bosses would do that, not gonna lie. Uppercuts does 3 damage instead of 2 in the final version, or does 3 damage in the prototype version and 2 in the final. And Speedbender Blue does 3 HP in the prototype and 2 in the final version. Alright, hitting Flamestag with Bubble Slash in either version will reset his pattern. In the prototype, he starts by doing wall jumps. In the final game, he'll throw 2 fireballs. Sound effects haven't been assigned yet, just weren't made for him yet, that's all. And it seems that he had a different death animation when you beat him. In the prototype version, Stag seems to, stagger, funny, after the last hit. In the final version, he just stops moving horizontal. Or stops moving horizontally, even if he's in midair at the time of impact. During this animation, he frequently jumps back towards X by 13 pixels, but not always. And here's a closer look at this death animation. That's too bad, there's a back gateway. So I guess we're just gonna look at it through this way. Yeah, I think the reason they changed that is because it looks a little goofy with him sliding like that. Miscellaneous. The early prototype is missing all palette cycling effects. The platforms in lava sink twice as quickly in the early prototypes, which they had to change that because, well, that would have been a little too hard for the player, I guess. In the early prototype only, the rising lava rubber bands. It rises faster if it's off-screen and slower if it's on-screen. In the early prototype, the lava in the sinking platform section kills X on contact, but in the later prototype versions and final, it only does 2 damage. Our Magna Centipede and Magne Hyakuliger. Alright, level design graphics. The background at the start of the stage was extended both upward and downward to a full 256 by 256 pixels. The background is actually big enough in the early prototype to avoid seeing where it cuts off, and here's what that looks like. And here's the final version. With this weird city in the background. But if the player uses a charged Crystal Hunter, the ripple effect will reveal where the background ends. As you can kind of see here, though it's not playing in real time, so you can't really see the ripple effect. At the center of the lights, question mark. In the background, I guess those are lights, they might be. In the background at the end of the stage are orange in the early prototype and are dark blue in later prototypes and final game. I guess I had to change it to make it look a little more mysterious-ish, I guess. I don't know. Looks like one of those mansion corridors, actually, from far away, but whatever. Alright, the early prototype has 2 strivers in this hallway. after those enemies were taken out of the stage's object set, so I guess they're originally going to show up in the stage, but they don't in the final game. The area was left empty. The final layout repopulates the hallway with 2 barrier attackers, or shield attackers as they're known as in the classic series. And here's a closer look at this room. Alright, in this prototype, I guess we can't look at that. You can see that there's no enemies here. And in the final game, once again, bad gateway, those shield attackers are there. Oh, and one of my least favorite segments in X2. Oh boy, I hated this. If y'all saw my playthrough, you know I don't like this segment. Our searchlights have yet to be placed in the early prototype. Likely they weren't made yet. To make up for this, the bleckers, yes. Those falling blocks have a name. They're called bleckers. Good to know, remember that. And bridges fall automatically. The first hiding place has wider walls in the earlier sample. The later prototype removes the first barrier attacker, while the final version adds 2 more and another blecker. The barrier attacker that was already in the stage was moved away from the searchlight pile-up at the end. Here's what that looks like. I guess this was just here while they made the searchlight gimmick in this stage, and we're just testing out the area we're working before they implemented that in. And here's the later prototype. Once again, bad gateway. Alright, here's what it looks like in the final game. Still can't see that closer. Personally, I think I prefer the later prototype version because less of these guys are here. Alright, the shutter on the left is always present in both samples, but it's not solid, so it's not that big of a deal. Not ideal, but whatever they fixed it, ha! The gap in the floor is wider in both prototype versions, and the final layout has another ledge on the right side with a large life energy pickup. Alright, here's a closer look at the prototype one. And once again, game, you're just too kind, giving us that HP. Alright, this is the only area with a searchlight trap in the early prototype, right over here, and if you don't know it's there, you're gonna fall right into it, so I'm glad they changed that. Give the player some more time to react. Alright, the shaft starts out narrow and opens up as the player falls down. As you can see here, in the later prototype, the searchlight shaft immediately opens up as soon as the player reaches the first scrabbler. The enemy placement matches the early prototype, but the more open layout makes them trivial to avoid. 2 searchlight traps have been added, but the player can ignore them by staying a safe distance away from the left wall. In the final game, the searchlight shaft is narrower, and the scrabblers and barlight last stars are placed out better. As you can see here, just so it makes it a little easier for the player to avoid them. The enemy placement... Oh, wait. These changes try to nudge the player to the right wall, away from the enemies, and try to and into the safe cover behind the searchlights. And here's a closer look at them. The layout in the early prototype is almost identical to the later prototype, though the 2 platforms at the top don't jut out as much as the extended further down. As usual, no searchlights have been placed yet, because they weren't made yet. It's very hard to get through this section without getting caught by the searchlights. More reasons why I don't like the stage. In the later sample, the final version narrows this section, but gets rid of 3 scrabblers, replacing one with a barlight last star. Or barlight last star, whatever it's pronounced. Places the searchlight further away from each other, and makes the save area behind the final light search wider, as you can see here. Alright, the image of X on the monitors are closer together in the final version. 2 of the blank monitors in the early prototype were filled in with images copied from other monitors in the later prototype. And here's a closer look at that. Kind of makes X look like a fat duck here, if you put all of his pieces together. And here's what it looks like in the final version, with an extra arm segment over here in these two little sections, too. A large life energy pickup was placed before the X ventral shutter. As you can see over here, just in case you're a little low on HP. This game is just too kind, right? The foreground railing in the Raider Killer's arena are clearly anchored in the bridge in the early prototype. While those tiles were deleted in later versions, those railings are also properly layered in from X and Raider Killer in the early version. While in the later prototype, they're laid behind them, as you can see here. The background decorations on the blue wall to the right were all moved down by 16 pixels. And here's a closer look at that. The final layout opens up the Raider Killer's arena, giving the player more space to avoid his attack. The foreground railings were deleted. Here's another closer look at that. Alright, bosses. Magnus Centipede doesn't teleport in during his animation. It just kind of pops into existence, likely because his teleporting animation wasn't done yet. Also, he might be, this is a hot take, but I think he might be related to Boomerang Kawanger from the first game. Whatever. The Silk Shot is more effective in the prototype by 2 HP. As you can see here, that is his weakness after all. The final game adds Strike Chain as a secondary weakness, though it was already partially weak in the prototype, as you can see here. And nerfs the charged spin wheel. A Silk Shot destroys Magnus Centipede's tail in both the early prototypes and the final game, but not in the later prototype, weirdly enough. I guess because maybe they took it out initially, they thought they didn't want it to do that, but then they decided to add it back later because it made the boss fight more interesting? I don't know. Magnus Centipede is silent but deadly in the sample version. Whatever that means. I hate to know what that means. Never mind, don't answer that. But I'm kind of glad they kept in his tail being destroyed, because this boss fight is kind of annoying. That when I first played X2, long before I made this channel, he was the first boss that I beat, so I guess. Alright, continuing on. Magnus Centipede does the same action in both the later prototype and the final game, but the prototype intro lasts a little too long, and he ends up snapping back into his idle pose, as you can see here. In the case you haven't caught on yet, the searchlights are larger in both prototypes. The early prototype is missing the checkpoint after the chop register fight. The next checkpoint comes before the Raider Killer fight in the early prototype in the other versions. This checkpoint is placed after the fight. And here is a bigger version of the spotlight, which looks a little more crudely drawn. Kind of like one of those pictures of like a little kid would draw. That's kind of what it looks like. When they make a circle and then color in it. That's what it looks like to me. And here's the final version. And I'm kind of glad they made them smaller too, because that section is already annoying as hell. Imagine how much more annoying it would be if they were larger. Alright, and finally, the background layout in the sample doesn't account for the hidden heart and sub-tank rooms. Pretty sloppy, eh? In the scan section before Raider Killer, the speed of falling boulders is ridiculously fast. May or may not be the result of unknown glitches present in this build. So the developers tweaked the falling speed to a generally acceptable speed in the final version so you can actually dodge them. Makes sense to me. The warned klaxon and red lights in the final section before the boss aren't present in either prototype. The objects in that area also behave differently. In the early prototype, the blenkers and bridges fall when X approaches them, but in the installers stay put. In the later prototype, the blenkers don't fall down, but the installers and bridges do. In the final game, all objects fall when X gets in close enough proximity to them. And here's a closer look at the heart tank room. and a closer look at the sub-tank room. Alright, and that'll be it for Magnus Centipede's stage. Next up, the other four Mavericks, starting with Overdrive Ostrich, but we will talk about these guys in part 3. So, if y'all learned something new and enjoyed this and you want to see more, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And as usual, answer the question of the day. Of all the unused things we went over so far, which one would you have liked to see in the final game the most and why? For me, some of those unused enemies would have been pretty cool. But anyways, thank y'all for watching. See y'all in part 3. Have a berrific day.